Hi guys, and welcome to TechFurb. Today we will be upgrading my personal gaming rig with an i3. Absolutely. I know it's going to... Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you did hear me correctly. I will be putting an i3 in my gaming rig. It is the i3 10100F. So for the uninitiated, what that means is 4 cores and 8 threads at 130 Australian dollars. US currency, if you know the US currency and how it works for you, it's about $100 US. So realistically, it's pretty good value. And compared to the AMD Ryzen options, it was the better option. This was the best bang for buck. The best Ryzen offering I could get, if it was in stock, would have been the Ryzen 3 3100, but there's supply shortages and it was more expensive than the CPU. The motherboard I would need to purchase to run it was also more expensive because I went with a H410, which was bottom of the barrel. It's a really crappy motherboard. Nothing against ASRock, but it's a cheap motherboard. That's why I bought it. And yeah, I mean, this is bang for buck. We'll be putting in some DDR4 2400 megahertz RAM. I'm also putting in an SSD for the game drive, which is going to be fun. It's 480 gig. I wanted a terabyte, but just couldn't quite stretch the budget to do it. But it'll hold at least 3 or 4 games, which is just insane. But anyway, that's what it does. And I should talk a little bit about the PC that it's going into. So this system here is an i7-3770. It has a GTX 1080 as the graphics card, and it is performing not so well. So there's nothing wrong with the 1080. The 1080 is performing quite well, hence the lack of upgrade. But the i7-3770 is not doing so well. So what you'll find is one of two things. In some cases, it can't hit 60 FPS in the real latest and greatest titles. So I'm talking your Cyberpunk 2077. There's a few other ones, like Assassin's Creed, things like that are really hard to run games. This CPU is struggling, partly because it's 7 years old and it only has 4 cores and 8 threads, which is ludicrous for me to say, considering that was supposed to be the gold standard like 3 years ago. But anyway, the market has changed, and 4 cores, 8 threads, entry level now. Anyway. Besides the point, so we'll be upgrading that CPU. I have run all the benchmarks on this system. We'll be doing 13 games. As I said, Cyberpunk 2077 is included. And then we'll upgrade it. We'll put in the CPU. I'll run the benchmarks. And then, well, we'll see how much better this gaming experience is going to be. Okay, so we've hit a slight roadblock. So the case being a full ATX case and the previous motherboard being a full ATX motherboard, it was cable managed perfectly. It was best I could get it. And that's great, but the new motherboard being a micro ATX board and a very small micro ATX board at that, it just doesn't conform to the same size. So all the cable runs and everything isn't going to actually fit this motherboard. So that's not a big issue. It just means I'm going to need to cut all my cable management and reroute the cables to make it make sense for this motherboard. That is quite boring for you to watch, so I'm going to fix this up and then we'll be back with me more building this computer out. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I have run the benchmarks now, and it's time to have a look at the results. So, starting off with Apex Legends, remember that this is a GPU intensive game, and subsequently we had a relatively dead even heat between the 10100F and the i7-3700. Sorry, I was about to say 30. No, it's 3770. It is a 3770. I'm getting my AMDs and my Intels all mixed up. They use the same names. It makes it difficult, but that's beside the point. We're seeing a slight advantage in average FPS, but I noticed a theme in before sitting down to actually record this segment. It's the 1% and the 0.1% lows that show the difference, because you'll see that the 0.1% lows are those stutters, where it drops below 60 FPS and the game sort of hitches and just jumps, and it doesn't feel buttery smooth. And that's the big difference between these two CPUs, having tested it now, and I've spent a fair bit of time. It's been about a week in between filming, and I've found that the difference between the i3 and the i7 is purely down to the smoothness of the feeling of it. It just feels smoother. It feels nicer. It's one of those things where it feels like a placebo effect until you look at 1% and 0.1% lows, and then you go, that is in the data where the difference is. So remember that going forward. In contrast to Apex Legends, we have CSGO. CSGO is a CPU intensive game, so it doesn't care as much about the graphics card. And here you can see it flicks around the other way. So the 226 frames per second on average for the i3. Yeah, it absolutely smashes the i7-3770 here. 3770 is not doing a terrible showing, 170 FPS. To be honest, unless you're a competitive gamer, I don't think you're going to notice it. And yes, the 1% and 0.1% frames per second are lower, but I use a 60Hz 1080p monitor, so I didn't notice the difference between the two CPUs in this title. Okay, it is time to talk about Cyberpunk 2077. The performance on both machines was below 60 FPS, but the experience in playing the game, I didn't have the stutters and the hitches when playing it with the i3. So the i3 feels smooth. I think, and again, this is the first time I run the benchmark, so I haven't got that historical data to back me up, but it feels like it's going to be more of a GPU intensive game than a CPU. It's just visually very appealing. There's lots of things happening in the, lots of lighting tricks and all the rest. And remember, I'm on a 1080, so I don't get RTX, but even without RTX, this game looks phenomenal. It's the best looking game I've ever seen. Again, more time to evaluate whether it's actually a good game or not. Okay, Dirt Rally 2.0. This is a game that I actively play myself. I quite enjoy it. We're seeing the slower FPS on 3770, so we are seeing a performance difference here. You're looking at about 15 to 10%. But remember, we're on a GTX 1080. The performance delta would be much more if we're on a higher end GPU, because that CPU can go a bit higher with the GPUs. So just bear that in mind. But performance, playable on both. But I am seeing a benefit from upgrading to this CPU in this game. Next is Doom Eternal. This is a game that will make the i7 look fantastic, because Doom Eternal seems to run really well on literally anything. It is a beautiful game that just all developers need to make more games like Doom Eternal, because it just runs like butter on anything. So, slight advantage to the 10100F. You could argue it's within error, and there was just no hitching. I couldn't tell the difference in this title. So, as I said, buttery smooth, i7, i3, no difference here. So if you're playing Doom Eternal, you're on an i7 3770, you're fine. Next is F1 2019. Now, this is, again, another game that I play. It is a game that does scale well with CPUs, because it's a lot about AI and a lot of physics, and it's a good-looking game. It is getting 2 years old now, but it's a good-looking game, but it has a lot of CPU physics, so the CPU does matter, and you can see a big difference in the performance between the two. So, I won't notice it on a 60 Hertz monitor, but if I had a high refresh rate monitor, I would notice a difference between these games, because you're looking at about a 25 to 30% jump going to that i3 over the i7. So this is where you start to see the difference. Where you're in CPU-bound games, there is a big jump to be had in upgrading the CPUs. Next is GTA 5. Now, very old title at this point. It's been out for like 7 years or 8 years or whatever it is on PC 2015, so 6 years for PC, but realistically it's a 2013 game. We are actually seeing a performance difference. I expected on GTA 5 being a title that was released in the era of the 3770, the 3770 would run it great, but apparently not. GTA 5 was hard to run, and here we can see a difference. There is that stuttering and hitching happening with that i7, so we're dropping below 60 FPS. We lose that buttery smooth feeling. So you will, again, see a benefit upgrading to the i3 from the i7. Next is Anno 1800. This is a game that I actively play and is probably one of the driving reasons for upgrading the CPU. So, have a look at the 1% and 0.1% lows. Do you notice how low they are? In fact, we dropped down to 10 FPS in the 0.1% lows. This is that stuttering and hitching. Anno is a CPU intensive game because it's an RTS, which means, you know, it does lots of calculations and so on and so forth. I saw a massive difference. I played a lot of Anno 1800 on the i3, and I just have not had the slowdown, the hitches, just the experience as a whole has been so much better on the i3 for me. And like I said, I actively play this game. So if you take anything away from this video, for Anno 1800 or any RTS, you will see a benefit upgrading from an old i7 to literally anything today. Because remember, 10100F is probably the worst new CPU you can buy on the market right now, excluding like a Celeron or something like that. But in terms of gaming CPUs that you would buy right now, it's bottom of the barrel, and it's beating an old i7, which it kind of should, but for a long time that wasn't the case. Okay, moving on. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Valhalla seems to be GPU bound, which, again, no historical data, but that's just an observation. We're not seeing a massive difference. The frame rates are really close, and it seemed to run well, but again, I don't know this game very well. I haven't played much of it, so time will tell what a good CPU in this is. Next is Far Cry New Dawn. I have been benchmarking this for a while. The CPU does have an impact on performance in this game. We can see that you are dropping below 60 FPS on the 3770. Technically, you drop below... Sorry, did I say 30? I meant 60. Technically, on the 10100F, you are dropping below 60, but it's the 58. And again, experience buttery smooth on the new CPU. Next is Ghost Recon Breakpoint. We are seeing a performance difference. This is a game, when I've played it, jumping forward, you would see a slight upgrade, but you wouldn't see a massive upgrade. So the i7 seems to really be hanging on with this game. Okay, next is Watch Dogs Legion, another new title in the roundup. It is a very graphically intensive game. It's getting close to sort of Cyberpunk 2077 levels of fidelity in terms of graphics. I'm on a 1080, so I'm not using RTX. But we're actually not seeing a massive benefit from being on the i3 versus the i7. So it seems to actually be a GPU bottlenecked game. So you wouldn't see benefit from upgrading from the i7, at least with the GTX 1080 or RTX 2060-ish class of GPU. So yeah, that's where that one's at. Next is Battlefield 5, a game that is starting to lose a little bit of relevance. There is a player base for it still. I personally like Battlefield 5. Not so much for the multiplayer, because I don't like multiplayer games. But single player campaigns, I really wish they were more than like 6 hours, because that content was really good. But anyway, that's beside the point. Battlefield 5 is a game that would definitely see a benefit for high refresh rate gaming, but it is a GPU bound game. And we can see that, again, not a lot of benefit from upgrading from the i7. So very interesting to see. We've looked at the benchmark data, we've done the build, done everything. So here is where I am at. This is my final thoughts on the upgrade. Should you upgrade from an i7 to an i3 if you're on an old i7? Yes, sort of. So you should just upgrade from that i7 to literally any modern CPU that you can afford. There is at last a big jump forward in performance. So what I'm talking about is, if you go back to like when in 2017 when I bought my Ryzen 7, I was in the market for something that could do primarily workstation, secondarily gaming. And back then, the fastest sort of normal Intel CPU you could get was an Intel i7 7700. Great for gaming, but terrible. Well, not terrible, but not ideal for workstation use because it had 4 cores and 8 threads. And at that time, you weren't seeing the big jump in performance from the previous generation CPUs. Intel had just sort of stagnated with performance. And the logic had been, for a very long time, that if you're on an old i7, there is no reason to upgrade to a new CPU because they are just not appreciably faster. At last, that has finally come to rest. The 10th generation Intel CPUs, or the 3rd generation Ryzen / 4th generation, so Zen 2, Zen 3 Ryzen CPUs, all of these new CPUs are now kicking the crap out of the old stuff. So you will genuinely get a benefit from upgrading to a modern CPU. Now is the time to upgrade, if you can buy one. I'm aware that there are shortages around the world. I bought my i3, it went out of stock like a month after I bought it. So it seems like CPUs and graphics cards in particular are just out of stock everywhere currently. But if you can find the hardware, you should be buying it. You should be upgrading your old CPU. So, thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I know this video might be a little bit longer than what you were probably expecting, but I like to go into detail. If you liked the video, please give it a like. If you disliked it, you can do that. Please get subscribed to the channel if you're not subscribed already. I do try to release videos at least once a month, preferably more frequently, but it just sort of varies. I do this for fun. So, you know, when I'm feeling it, I'm making videos. When I'm not feeling it, I'm not making videos. So, they'll come out when they come out. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.